Hello, everyone. Hi. Hi. Where's Tilly gonna sit? Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alexis Johnson. I'm a partner here at Paula Cooper Gallery. It is a pleasure to have you all with us today. On behalf of the gallery, I would like to thank you for joining this special conversation with Cynthia Hawkins and Donna de Salvo. We're delighted to host both Cynthia and Donna, and I'd like to share a little bit about their remarkable contributions. Excuse me, I have this allergies. Since 1972, Cynthia Hawkins has been exploring and inflecting the field of abstract painting, creating deeply considered series of works informed by literary, philosophical, and scientific thought. Her visual language, rooted in symbols and signs, explores the interplay of color, movement, and light. In the 1970s and 80s, she was a key figure in the vibrant communities surrounding Black-owned New York galleries like Just Above Midtown, Cynthia Gallery, and Concalba House. Her work was also featured in major exhibitions at the Bronx Museum of the Arts, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Clock Tower Gallery. More recently, she was included in Just Above Midtown, Changing Spaces at the Museum of Modern Art. Cynthia holds a BA in painting from Queens College, an MFA from the Maryland Institute of College of Art, and earned a PhD from the University at Buffalo in 2019. She does not rest. She's very busy. Her dissertation, African American Agency and the Art Object, 1868 to 1917, is an important contribution to the understanding of the impact of Black artists in American history. In 2023, she received the Helen Frankenthaler Award in painting, and later this year, she will be a featured artist in the 36th Sao Paulo Biennial. Donna de Salvo brings over 3 decades of curatorial and institutional leadership experience to the conversation. She returned to the Dia Art Foundation in 2020 as Senior Adjunct Curator for Special Projects, having started her curatorial career there in the early 1980s. And it was during this time that Cynthia and Donna met because they both worked at Dia in the early 80s. Very exciting for them to be reunited here. Donna went on to serve in major roles at Tate Modern and the Whitney Museum of Art, where she was the first chief curator and deputy director for programs. As a leading Warhol scholar, Donna has curated and co-curated significant retrospectives of artists including Helia Otisika, Ronnie Horn, Lawrence Weiner, and Ed Ruscha, whose US pavilion she co-curated with Linda Norden at the 51st Venice Biennale. Most recently, she organized 2 powerful presentations of Steve McQueen's work at Dia Chelsea and Dia Beacon, both on view through June 2025. Today's conversation will center on Cynthia's recent publication, Art Notes Art, released by the Center for Art Research and Alliances, also known as CARA, late last year. The book offers a journal-style account of key developments in her career during the late 1970s and early 1980s. A document of routine and the everyday, it sketches notes for both new and in-progress work, and reflections on contemporary art and criticism. Through this, Cynthia brings her process, her experimentation, and her thinking around materials, formalism, abstraction, and figuration into sharp focus. And of course, we'll also talk about the exhibition, and I guess some of your shared history I know you want to bring up as well. We'll open the floor to audience questions following the conversation, but for now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cynthia Hawkins and Donna de Salvo.
Thank you, Alexis. I'm maybe sounding a little less like Minnie Mouse than I did this morning, but hopefully with the microphone you can all hear me, right? Okay, good. Well, I'm really delighted to be here. Delighted. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, thank you, Tilly. Tilly approves. And also delighted to be sitting here amongst these extraordinary works by Cynthia. You know, we met through and at the Dia Art Foundation. So we have this very interesting history, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And we kind of kept in touch and then actually reconnected when I saw your work included in the MoMA Jam exhibition. And I sort of saw a label and it said Cynthia Hawkins, and I thought, could it be the same Cynthia Hawkins? And I was delighted that indeed it was. And so we had a really wonderful, reunion, so to speak. But to get sort of right down to things, and the book is available for sale back there. I don't get a cut or anything. It's just a great book. But can you say a bit of, the book, it largely covers the period 79, 79, 80, it's a little bit in that. Why did you decide to publish this book?
Well, first, thank you to Paula Cooper and the gallery and the staff for this exhibition and for your support and for this talk. And thanks to all of you for being here. I appreciate it. The weird thing about the book is I had always a sense of that I wanted to publish it. And while this was being edited, and after Cara got it, I found these other documents in my files, letters to a publisher about it, trying to figure out how to publish it, get it published, or publish it myself. And did I want to publish it I think I just wanted to publish it for myself, because I think that I did always have a little bit of a sense of creating an archive for myself. And, but I never thought that it was, I don't know if I thought it'd be useful for others. I just have I just like paper and I like books. And, as I say, I have many books with 20 pages written in them. And I would keep a journal for 20, 30 pages. And then I'd stop, I'd see another book, I'd get another one, I'd do another 10 pages. This is I have books all around that document certain periods, but I also at the same time feel a little, trepidation at filling an entire book. It's too many pages, so I only do 10 or 20. But I just wanted, and then, when I was in grad school for my MFA, I met Anne Truitt. She was a visiting artist, and her book, The Day Book, had come out. And I saw that, and I read that, and I thought, again, I have that. I did that. I did that 10 years before I wrote that book, so that also encouraged me. But I carried it with me everywhere we went, so.
Well, I know one of the things you told me was that you've actually been keeping a diary since you were 12 years old. So this notational writing is something that you've really carried forward for many years, and I assume you still do.
Yes, I still do it. But it's consistently inconsistent. So, but I do and the less formal the book is, the easier it is to keep doing it. If you have a construction paper, fold it in half and fill it full of blank typing paper, that works really well too. So.
Well, I think for the reader, if you will, the book really informs us a lot about your work and the thinking behind it, and also those early years in New York in the 70s and 80s. And, one thing that I found very, important for me here was seeing how important science is to you. Because you talk about the Fibonacci system and, these paintings, which are, of course, grappling with this notion of the fourth dimension and what science, provides for you. It pops up throughout the book. There's certain moments where it's sort of concentrated. You can see that's where your thinking is at. Then it sort of goes away, but never really goes away. It's just not on the page. And then you return to it. So, I mean, and you mentioned a phrase to me, which I don't dare understand. Maybe you can talk about it. But you even talk about this notion of quantum entanglements. And I was very curious about, your relationship to science, and was that something that came early for you in your thinking, in your education? Because clearly it's very important to you.
Well, it is, but I have to admit that I was not very good at math. And so, so I could read about it and it made sense, but I couldn't do those word problems you had in math. I would get it and then it would disappear by the time I got home. So it's like, but thing is, I had a period where I wanted to be a lot of things. And one of the things I wanted to be was a scientist and build rocket ships, and things like that. But occasionally I wanted to be a playwright as well. So, it's like all over. But science to me gives me, an opportunity. It's an opportunity to dream, and to take this very formal, challenging ideas and give me a place where I can wonder what would happen if, and what does this mean? What does it look like if I do this? Like now, quantum entanglements. I mean, if you all know Neil deGrasse Tyson, he has a podcast called Star Talk, and all these scientists are on it all the time. And one of the recent ideas they talked about was quantum entanglement, and that the whole universe is connected by these intersecting lines like a graph, and that if you cut the graph or the mesh, as it were, that the whole universe would fall apart. So but it also says at the same time that everything ultimately is connected, from, the trees, the roots of the trees, to the galaxies, millions of light years away. It's all connected. So, but it has a sense of, it gives you a sense of possibility for me as a painter, of what could be, what does that look like? And so that's how I use it.
We'll come back to some of those ideas. I mean, the other thing that is so striking here is what it reveals actually also about the art world of the 70s and the 80s, and also earlier periods, and what was happening amongst Black artists. And we talked a few days ago about, I mean, you note some of the artists who were mentors to you. And I wondered if you could, just talk a bit more. Some of them are names. There were many people I did not know. I think they were at Queens College, but how they impacted. Did they get what you were trying to do? Because I think when one is a student, there's always that sense of, does somebody really understand what I'm trying to do? Were those connections made at that point? Do you remember?
Well, I would say that, so this is true, and this is what I say. I don't remember much doing anything I was supposed to do. Keeping a drawing notebook to draw everywhere all the time. I never did that. I would try, but I just didn't. But I read a lot. And once I gave up, figurative painting, with my last figurative painting of some gymnasts in a gym that was invented, and realized that I was just interested in how things moved, or how the figures moved you from one part of the canvas to the other, I stopped. That was it. And then I just used the equipment as my source material for the drawings. And I would go to the gym and just draw the weights and the horse, that you jump over. And I just kept doing it. And one thing early on was noticing Mondrian's drawings of trees and how those trees broke down and became abstraction. And in the similar way, drawing the gym equipment led me to geometric abstraction. And then that led me somewhere else. But so I sort of began in a way of seeing how what is in front of me can become something else if you keep working it.
Well, we were talking a bit about the artist Camille Bishop, who you said would sometimes sell work for artists, but that she said Black people don't like abstraction.
Yeah.
So, I wondered if it's sort of been interesting because there is that whole resistance to artists like Mel Edwards and Jack Whitten, but you continued along the lines of making abstraction.
So Camille Billups, you might know, she was a filmmaker and ceramic artist, and she did a bunch of stuff. And she used to do the Black Arts Fair. She knows. Peg Alston was also a gallerist, and she participated in that as well, and back then. And yeah, Camille would always ask me for a couple of pieces for this fair, and would tell me, well, nobody's gonna buy it, because, but yeah, you give it to me anyway. She said, those Black people don't like abstraction. And this was like in the early 90s still. And, but it was, it didn't matter. She liked, she was supporting me, whether people bought it or not. And it did really did change soon after that, but we have to remember that, from the 70s and the Black Arts movement and the historical path that, we went through as a country in the late 60s, and, sort of civil rights work and social justice works created by Black artists was very important, and how to, support the civil rights movement. You needed, and I would agree at the time, that you needed, things people could recognize and, align themselves with, But I could never change horses. I'm like that kind of artist.
Was there the thought that abstraction in some way was a sort of elitist?
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? It was sort of elitist back, from the abstract expressionists into crooning, even though I would say that those artists who were doing that at the time weren't thinking of it that way, that it did appeal to a more sort of intellectual kind of audience, more rarefied. But,
But Romare Bearden made abstract expressionist work at one point.
Romy Bearden started as an abstract painter. And during, Spiral and that moment of, working against this South Africa and civil rights, he found the collage that he became famous for. So, everybody changes, right? Where they will, so.
So, I think one of the things that the book makes clear is you have a very research-based practice, and to an extent, obviously the work your interest in science. I know you love to read and you love to learn. So after the BFA and the MFA, you pursue a PhD, which doesn't seem likely for a lot of visual artists, frankly. And what led you to want to make that level of investment? And even how did you get to the topic African American Agency in Art Objects, 1865 to 1917? Because that's also not as well known an area in the history of African American art. I mean, was that what drew you to that topic?
So in between, I got a MA in museum studies.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Compulsive, yes. Okay. So, and that was really so I could compete with the younger people who are coming up through, art history, and when, there's a proliferation of nonprofits, for galleries and all kinds of organizations. So, but so I think they're all sort of connected, I mean, as an artist, I liked showing other artists' work. I started doing curating shows for Rockland Community College in the library. Then, and that evolved, and I got a job at New Paltz teaching, drawing and 2D. And with my students, especially the grad students, I organized a show for them. And so it just goes on and on. So, but doing the PhD was really about wanting to know why things are the way they are. And I didn't really want to do art history. That really wasn't what I had in mind. And I also knew that art history was also extremely difficult. I mean, I knew people who were really wanted to be art historians, and they could not get into any program, and they, because they only take 4 people. So, but what I found, the reason how I got to my dissertation is during the coursework, my seminars, I would take a historical look at things like, early World's Fairs, especially like the 1901 in Buffalo. I would look at certain areas where I was taking a seminar and then see where I could, insert sort of a historical and theoretical framework to some aspect of, say, Black history, Black art history. And so, I mean, and things just bubble up, you read enough and suddenly you see this woman's name come up. There's this organization begins, it becomes nationwide, and then they start trying to do work to better everyone's life. And so this woman, Lottie Wilson, comes up, and because you're looking at, these old magazines, and from 1880s, 1890s, and Lottie Wilson's coming up, bubbles up. And then you say, and of course, in the way people are referred to in this period, especially women, is they're like Mrs. Smith. They have no first names. And, they're Mrs. So-and-so. So then you have to figure out if this is the same person, if Wilson is the same person as, Johnson, So, and so it gets like that. And it's super interesting. It's really, so, and I found Lottie, Black woman, travels around the country by herself. She has private exhibitions at people's homes. And, in Baltimore and DC, she's well known. She has families from Niles, Michigan. So there's this whole life there. And the only coverage you do see, you can find sometimes, material on them in newspapers. Because one of the interesting things about Blacks during the 19th century, early 19th century, is that they had their own magazines and newspapers. And so they would follow artists like, Edmonia Lewis. They all knew Edmonia was in Italy. Somebody went to go see her, so there is material out there for some people, So anyways, that's how I got to that. So I wanted to like put a spotlight on these few people, how their collection started, and yeah, so
But this was going on parallel with you making art?
yeah.
And how did that, and one thing I was curious about is, I think you were at the University of Leicester?
Yeah.
And-
I started my PhD journey by trying to do it, virtually at the University of Leicester. And I did a year, the first year, and it was quite different than here. But then the Department of Education changed their rules, so I couldn't keep doing that. And it took 2 years for me to decide if I really wanted to keep going and where would I do it and whatever. So,
Well, I have to say, knowing many people who are ABD, all but dissertation, I think having, maintaining an art practice and doing the other is pretty exceptional. You may not see that, but I think it is. Did any of that, I'm curious, like, how that came into your thinking about being an artist, because, and one of the things you also mentioned, which I think a lot of people don't realize, is during that 70s period, there were a lot of nonprofits, there were a lot of government grants that were available. The NEA gave direct grants to artists, and I know you talk about in the book preparing the application for the NEA. But there was a fairly rich support system, maybe not massive amounts of money, but enough money for people to keep going and also to feel confirmed in a way.
yeah, so, well, you have to keep in mind until, let's see, I can remember his name. I mean, a lot of Black artists didn't get those grants, but people always tried. And but it was something that was artists across the boards really wanted. And sometimes, they could find an alternative way to get grants by doing things that were community-based, but the 70s, I mean, it seemed like it was more open, right, in some ways. I mean, I was always hesitant to like, oh God, I'm gonna do this. I mean, I still like, when I say, oh yeah, I should apply for that. And then I rarely ever do because the deadline passed before I can focus on it.
But but also, as you say, there was obviously, there were a lot of Black artists and other artists who were not, their work wasn't being selected. I mean,
Right.
the art world at that time was very different. And, I know from when my colleague Matilda here, when we did Jack Whitten, the paintings of the Greek alphabet series up at Beacon, Courtney Martin wrote about the fact that, there were a few shows that happened at the Whitney in the early 70s under pressure of Mel Edwards and Jack Whitten, but, they gave them a summer slot in the lobby gallery. And if you remember the lobby gallery of the old Boyer building, it was a very small space. It was hardly the primo spot.
Right.
And so, fortunately, things have changed a lot in a very good way, but it's sometimes hard for people to remember that. I mean, people who lived through it will remember it, but, it was a very different era
Yeah, it's really.
of recognition.
But, as you say, people keep working. They keep going, they keep doing it, and start their own organizations, own galleries like Kinkelva, like Cinque, Studio Museum. They all like popped up around the same time, at 72, 73, 74. And Kinkelva is still around. Cinque only closed a few years ago. And so.
And, you were in AIR or not?
Because I know
Yeah.
my friend Vivian Brown was in AIR. Yeah. And
I mean, it's interesting because the art worlds, there was sort of feminist artists on one
Yes.
side, white feminist artists, black feminist artists, and, they were very separate worlds,
Yeah.
fundamentally.
yeah.
Again, of course, in like the UK, it was interesting. There was a show, a tape written a few years back that looked at black feminism. And I think it was the first show that had ever happened that actually really took on board the subject matter. So, let's get back to, abstraction and your, what is the attraction for you? Like, what does, what is it? You said something to me about realism and figuration that assigns intent, that it's fixed. And you said, and I don't see the fun in it too.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing with, figuration is, for me, is that, it's like, it writes its own narrative. Like everyone who looks at it, it writes its own a narrative for each viewer. So, and you cannot get away from the body, or the object that you recognize. So for abstraction, for me, it's an open field, and I can do anything, and that's what I need. I can take what is objectively real and concrete, but I can still reinterpret it. I can reimagine it. It can be something else. And that is my goal. And I certainly, that may be hard to access for the viewer, but I am totally open to talking to people about what I do. So to make it, more understandable, to see, to expand the viewers, understanding of what art is and can be. I mean, when I was a curator at the college, my mission, even though I've certainly showed, figurative and work and landscape and all of this, I also, would provide programming that would look at this work and try to expand its possibilities for, for students or whoever was looking at it. How does this fit into the larger scheme of things? How does, say, a show about Native American beadwork, right? That's one thing. So you have to talk about the history of Native Americans and how to access economic independence with that. But also with that is, what else is going on there? What about diabetes in Native American communities? What about the literature that talks about all kinds of, mythologies within that community? So I just think that we have to, or I have to expand its potential.
That's
Art's potential.
that's ahead of its time. And to a large extent, like really thinking about the objects, but then thinking about them in a larger cultural, political, social context, which I don't want to say it's a given now, but I think it's, a way more interesting way of trying to understand, especially when one is outside of a cultural context. Right. I think, one thing I just did not know at all, and you have some installation photographs in here, is that you made sculpture. And, that they're extremely constructivist, linear, collage based, and I think they give a lot of insight into your paintings as well, and this interest in science that you have. And I know you're kind of slightly apologetic because you've got these slides in here that you've made images from. I know they're not, but I kind of love that in a way. There's something about the texture of this book. It's not slick. It's really so much about the process of making itself. But yeah, so like, what happened with why sculpture, and were you doing 3D work and 2D works at the same time?
Why sculpture? I finished my BA, and I don't know. I think that I'm going to say, and I'm pretty sure this is honestly true, that I was watching Star Trek on TV. And they had an episode with the planet killer, which, when I say today, if you know that asteroid that passed by a couple of years ago, Oumuamua, totally looks like the planet killer. But so I saw this episode, and then I just made a planet killer. I made this this sculpture with wire. I covered it with polyethylene. I sewed these shapes, these symbolic shapes onto it, and I hung it from the ceiling in my living room. So, and that was how I started. And then I just made a couple of more things, and then did an installation with colored polyethylene in my living room with stapling plastic. It got to be like, and then came the walk in 4D, and then came, that's the late 70s, like 79 or something. And then I started with these, and the bug, which I showed at just about Midtown when I was on 57th Street in the summer show, the group show that they let me in, which, I sure, like that time that Linda did not expect me to show up with wire sculptures to staple to the wall. And, but yeah, and then it was like, so here we are talking about space all the time, the planet killer. And then I make these other things, these drawings of these trapezoidal shapes spinning in space on black, charcoal background. And so we do a whole bunch of those, and then they come off the page, and then they're three-dimensional wall hangers, and then there's a life-size one. So to me, it's like I just follow the crumbs. It's like you start somewhere and just keep moving it, and it gets adjusted and builds on itself. And so, but I have to say that I keep all of this. It all stays resonant. And this is why I say, if I talk about my work, I always have to start at the beginning, because it's the continuity of, from the beginning to now is so evident. I will not pretend that this is all new. There's one aspect that's new, because the forms, the writing, the shapes, the circles, the triangles, they have been there. They keep coming back differently. So.
And I don't have a watch, so I have no idea what time it is, which is really bad on my part.
Do you want to have another follow-up, or should I start opening it up? I can't open it up to
Do we have
questions.
a few more minutes?
We can.
Okay. Well, no. We just have to get to a couple more topics. Sorry, everybody, but which makes sense that you actually curated a show at the gallery of artists, of sculptors' drawings.
Yes.
Which makes tremendous sense. So I want to get to our shared history. I have some of my colleagues from DIA here, and they often hear me talk about the DIA of the 80s. And I'll get to it through an artist that Dia worked with, actually, that I know is one of your favorites, and that's Cy Twombly.
Yes, Cy Twombly. I thought, first, I think I saw, in text, some of his early paintings that appear to be, marks on chalkboard, But when I saw 55 Days at Ilium, there was just nothing. I mean, there was no words to say.
It's in Philadelphia, if you haven't ever seen it. It's Philadelphia Museum.
Just amazing. Just amazing.
Was it the conceptual aspects of the mark making? Well,
It's
because
the
you're
mark making, it's the scale.
Yeah.
Which is, weird because, in that book, I was reading it again today. And I have this whole thing about scale and how, it doesn't have to, size doesn't matter, and scale, whatever, back and forth. And I'm like, what?
Well, that's the advantage. That's the advantage when you write something and you go back to it.
Yeah, like 40 years earlier. Okay, so
I know you also talked about, to me, later on, seeing Fred Sandback's work in Beacon, and the simplicity.
Yes.
And people don't realize that at the time we worked at Dia, Fred's work really wasn't on view in Dia, but there was a museum up in Winchendon, New Hampshire, and that was the Fred Sandback Museum. And of course, he's been shown at Beacon, many times. I mean, when we worked at Dia, so I worked in the curatorial department and you were at the front desk.
First, I was in the curatorial
That's
department
right,
and you
that's
arrived.
right, that's right.
And then there was some shakeup, and I ended up at Heiner's front desk, which was like, who wanted to be there? Nobody.
Nobody wanted. Well, 107 Franklin Street were the central administrative offices, and that was, I would go there with my colleagues periodically for meetings, but that was like a whole other vibe.
Yeah.
Heiner kind of ruled there. This is Heiner Friedrich, who was one of the founders of the Dia Art Foundation. And, in a way, when I joined Dia, I was hired first as a registrar, and there was an extraordinary man, Jeffrey Crass. I often correct, because sometimes people say I was the first curator at Dia, and I say, oh, no. And Jeffrey was an extraordinary man and died way too soon, but an amazing scholar, passionate. And then after that, Heiner, said, well, I think he just said, well, you want to be the curator? And I said, well, yeah, okay. I mean, it's what I wanted to be. And, so in a lot of ways, Dia gave me that opportunity to be able to think more like a curator, and of course to work with all of those artists. But at times we really had no idea what the hell the place was about.
It's true. It changed a lot all the time, and there were, all those satellite spaces all over, and who knew what was going on in any of them?
And things would change.
Yes,
they could be like you're doing one thing one day, and then there was like a new idea that came to the fore, and then there were the artists too, who the one thing is, when I worked in the curatorial department, I remember I had worked at MoMA and International Center for Photography, and I said to Heiner, I said, we have to have hygrothermographs so that we can measure, the relative pH. And if you know Heiner Friedrich, you kind of get this, but it was like, the paintings in Europe have been around for centuries, and there's no hygrothermographs. And so anything, that had a certain kind of a technical, like contemporary idea, but we were the orphan child because we didn't have an artist behind us. We had the collection, but if you worked for one of the artists, you could usually get what you wanted.
Yeah, you could get anything, yeah.
So, but it was a very, very different kind of place, but in a way for both of us, sort of a formative, experience to the extent
Yeah.
you got a salary.
You got a salary for like being around art and like meeting, like, I mean, I remember, the poet, Rene Ricard.
Rene Ricard.
Yeah.
Rene Ricard.
He was like upstairs, he had a office or desk.
He had a desk.
Running
Yes,
around.
yeah.
I remember I still have a copy of the book they published.
Yes, the deal book.
When she arrived as a registrar, I was like incredibly intrigued by this. And so I used to talk to her about it, and then she gave me this little registration handbook, and I thought, this is something I could do, so, because you have to have a job. So, all right. So I still have it somewhere.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Wow. That's so great. Yeah. So it's sort of wonderful to have had that. So I know we want to open it to questions, but I really encourage you to get the book. And I can see how it's also really an important book for young artists, because I think one thing that it charts is the very non-linear journey of being an artist. And, the ups, the downs, the mistakes, the going backwards, forwards, and there's a lot of humility in this book. And then there are moments when you're like, oh, I can do this, and so it really looks at that kind of duality that I think is very much part of the creative person's temperament. And you are a real teacher, because every reference to a name or an exhibition or something the reader might not know has a real footnote. Even things that seem very well, it's very clear that you do. So thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Donna.
Okay, I think we're going to open to some.
Oh, yes, Chile agrees. Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Donna, especially knowing that you have a little bit of throat. So it was sincerely appreciated. And so to follow that, we'd like to open it to questions. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. We have one in the back, and she's going to bring her microphone. She's going to bring a microphone over to you so everyone can hear you.
I don't need a microphone. Anyway, hello. Cynthia, I noticed in these works that you overlap a lot. And I'm wondering, how are they planned overlaps? Or do you draw? Well, you don't draw before? Or how do you plan the overlaps?
So, the first thing is just to, put some color on there. But there is like a sort of process. Sometimes it's because this work, I wanted to include the mapping in the background. The color goes on, then the map goes on wherever it ends up. And then generally shapes go on top of that. And then there's going back into the color because it's not heavy enough. So, and then color changes, and then there's more shapes, more, and then the last thing is the surface map, which is the oil bar. So after halfway, the halfway point is where things become really intentional. Before that, things can change anyway. And so, people who know me know sometimes I send them pictures in process. Well, I do. Victor, a couple of people, I send them pictures in process just because. And then, but I also use it to look at myself later. And, but it's interesting. What happens is there's this whole, record of the, changes and the evolution of each of these things, because they don't just happen. There's, and I don't do, you asked earlier if I did the sculpture and painting at the same time. No, not at all. And I don't really do two paintings at once. I will throw stuff at a second one, and I'll might do something, well, if I have to wait a day or so for something to dry so I can use tape. So I might do that. But especially when I get halfway, there's only one painting at a time because everything at that point is, quite meaningful what I do and don't do.
Because the one back there is the first, correct, in the
Yes.
series? Because it's interesting to me how, there's a there's a sort of tightness there, and then there's a kind of lyricism in the way these almost like cutout paper that's floating in space. But the one thing it's, is the grid, which of course always has a symbolic reference in terms of modernism. And, does it mean anything to you other than, does it have a metaphor? Is it symbolic? Or is it just, it's another form, it's another map kind of thing, a grid almost of the city?
Well, the way I use it is to really accentuate depth, and because if you see it the right way, then you see a really much more, almost like a three-dimensional, have a three-dimensional kind of experience in certain parts of it. But that's what I use it for. I mean, I have used the grid for many years in different ways. And I still want to use that grid, but I would like to use it differently to curve space, as it were. And, but it'll get there. I mean, the thing about this Maps Necessary series, this is the third iteration of it, and each one has been somewhat different, is that I can see in the end that there is only the map, but multiple maps, still exaggerating or making felt a real sense of depth, and somehow, because I mean, it's the overlapping and the color choices and all those things that
All
really,
that layering. that goes
layering that
on.
makes
Yeah.
for the space.
Yeah.
In the painting.
Yeah. Are there other questions?
Do you have a question?
There?
Thank you. Donna, for someone who lost her voice, you did much better than many I know in conversation. So beautiful conversation. Thank you so much. I called your show here Poetic Spring because maybe because of you, we got finally spring. It's just so beautiful to come in and a joy, a true joy. So hopefully I'll bring many kids to come and enjoy it and sit and get inspired by you, because it's a real power. But for someone that is fascinated with science and innovation, I wonder whether you are going to touch AI in any way coming into your work.
Well, I'll be honest and say no, because because color and touch mean everything to me in my work. So that's why I think that, but I'm not sure, but I think AI can't do what I do. And
I have a question. Hi. I'm curious, in the title, the fourth dimension, you've been looking at the fourth dimension since the 70s. What does it mean to you? Are you trying to get somewhere? You talk about a map. Is there a destination? Can you talk a little bit further about the fourth dimension? Thank you.
I think that the map is about getting somewhere else. And, but it's, it makes what I like to think of about this map is the very early maps, at the, I think it's called a Puri map. How the world was, how they are portrayed, the map is portrayed upside down to us, and how that now it's like the way we read a map, those maps are upside down. But I think that, yes, it's about getting somewhere. It's about making, connections between what is near and what is far. I mean, like in that painting over there, there's these circles, 4 circles with the green showing through. So the inside those circles are the original, is the original laying down of the paint, right? So I kept it because of the way the brush work is, the way the color, come together and not, or they're sort of like translucent, the white over the green and the brush marks. So that I keep that because it feels like another place inside there. So, you can also think like this map is a map to get you to another, dimension, another galaxy, another place. And what's there? Anything.
Well, it's kind of it's somewhere and nowhere. I mean, that's to me the tension that's so fascinating, because there's a kind of, the language, like with the grid or with the lines or all of these forms, but it's what the nature of like abstraction allows for, a place that it almost is, it's not spiritual, it's almost cosmic in some way, it's limitless, and yet it's within the painting, because you're always back within the painting ultimately in terms of how all these forms are, put together. And I did think a bit about the digital, to your point there, but I think it's so complicated now, because I think we have a tendency to want to read everything through the digital, even though you have been making work since the pre-digital. It's such a complicated issue that we want to lay that on to this, what we see. But I love this idea in your work of defining these places that also are never fixed, because it's what the viewer then, this is that aspect of abstraction, which, we've gone through periods where abstractions, right now we're in a big era of figuration, but abstraction persists. And I think because it does allow for something that can't be defined. And that's a very, both, scary, but at the same time, open-ended kind of conversation. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's what I love about it. It is open-ended. I mean, even in these circles in this work where you can see through, like an invisible circle, so that what's inside that circle becomes a separate painting even, So, I mean, the possibilities are ridiculous, and that's what I love.
That's a great line.
I think we should end it on the possibilities are ridiculous.
I
Yay.
like that.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
I want you to meet Amy. I want